Leninist freedom. How, then, do things stand with freedom? Here is how Lenin stated his position in a polemic against the Menshevik and socialist revolutionaries' critique of Bolshevik power in 1922. Indeed, the sermons which the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries preach express their true nature. The revolution has gone too far. What you are saying now, we have been saying all the time. Permit us to say it again. But we say in reply, permit us to put you before a firing squad for saying that. Either you refrain from expressing your views, or, if you insist on expressing your political views publicly, in the present circumstances, when our position is far more difficult than it was when the White Guards were directly attacking us, then you will have only yourselves to blame if we treat you as the worst and most pernicious White Guard elements. This Leninist freedom of choice, not life or money, but life or critique, combined with Lenin's dismissive attitude towards the liberal notion of freedom, accounts for his bad reputation among liberals. Their case largely rests upon their rejection of the standard Marxist-Leninist opposition of formal and actual freedom. As even leftist liberals like Claude Lefort emphasize again and again, freedom is in its very notion formal, so that actual freedom equals the lack of freedom. That is to say, with regard to freedom, Lenin is best remembered for his famous retort, "Freedom? Yes, but for whom? To do what?" For him, in the case of the Mensheviks quoted above, their freedom to criticize the Bolshevik government effectively amounted to freedom to undermine the workers' and peasants' government on behalf of the counter-revolution. Today, is it not obvious, after the terrifying experience of really existing socialism, where the fault of this reasoning resides? First, it reduces a historical constellation to a closed, fully contextualized situation in which the objective consequences of one's acts are fully determined. Independently of your intentions, what you are doing now objectively serves. Second, the position of enunciation of such statements usurps the right to decide what your acts objectively mean, so that their apparent objectivism, the focus on objective meaning, is the form of appearance of its opposite, the thorough subjectivism. I decide what your acts objectively mean, since I define the context of a situation. Say, if I conceive of my power as the immediate equivalent/expression of the power of the working class, then everyone who opposes me is objectively an enemy of the working class. Against this full contextualization, one should emphasize that freedom is actual precisely and only as the capacity to transcend the coordinates of a given situation, to posit the presuppositions of one's activity, as Hegel would have put it, i.e. to redefine the very situation within which one is active. Furthermore, as many a critic pointed out, the very term really existing socialism, although it was coined in order to assert socialism's success, is in itself a proof of socialism's utter failure, i.e. of the failure of the attempt to legitimize socialist regimes. The term really existing socialism popped up at the historical moment when the only legitimizing reason for socialism was a mere fact that it exists. Is this, however, the whole story? How does freedom effectively function in liberal democracies themselves? Although Clinton's presidency epitomizes the third way of today's ex-left succumbing to the rightist ideological blackmail, his healthcare reform program would nonetheless amount to a kind of act, at least in today's conditions, since it would have been based on the rejection of the hegemonic notions of the need to curtail big state expenditure and administration. In a way, it would do the impossible. No wonder, then, that it failed. Its failure, perhaps the only significant, although negative, event of Clinton's presidency, bears witness to the material force of the ideological notion of free choice. That is to say, although the large majority of the so-called ordinary people were not properly acquainted with the reform program, the medical lobby, twice as strong as the infamous defense lobby, succeeded in imposing on the public the fundamental idea that with universal healthcare, free choice in matters concerning medicine will be somehow threatened. Against this purely fictional reference to free choice, all enumeration of hard facts. In Canada, healthcare is less expensive and more effective, with no less free choice, etc., proved ineffective. Here we are at the very nerve center of the liberal ideology. Freedom of choice, grounded in the notion of the psychological subject, endowed with propensities he or she strives to realize. This especially holds today, in the era of what sociologists like Ulrich Beck call risk society, when the ruling ideology endeavors to sell us the insecurity caused by the dismantling of the welfare state as the opportunity for new freedoms. You have to change jobs every year, relying on short-term contracts instead of a long-term stable appointment. Why not see it as the liberation from the constraints of a fixed job, as the chance to reinvent yourself again and again, to become aware of and realize hidden potentials of your personality? You can no longer rely on the standard health insurance and retirement plan, so that you have to opt for additional coverage for which you have to pay. Why not perceive it as an additional opportunity to choose either better life now or long-term security? And if this predicament causes you anxiety, the postmodern or second modernity ideologist will immediately accuse you of being unable to assume full freedom, of the escape from freedom, of the immature sticking to old stable forms. Even better, when this is inscribed into the ideology of the subject as the psychological individual pregnant with natural abilities and tendencies, then I, as it were, automatically interpret all these changes as the results of my personality, not as the result of me being thrown around by market forces. Phenomena like these make it all the more necessary today to reassert the opposition of formal and actual freedom in a new, more precise sense. What we need today, in the era of liberal hegemony, is a Leninist traité de la servitude libérale, a new version of La Boétise, traité de la servitude volontaire, that would fully justify the apparent oxymoron liberal totalitarianism. In experimental psychology, Jean-Léon Beauvoir took the first step in this direction with his precise exploration of the paradoxes of conferring on the subject the freedom to choose. Repeated experiments established the following paradox. If, after getting from two groups of volunteers the agreement to participate in an experiment, one informs them that the experiment will involve something unpleasant, against their ethics even, and if, at this point, one reminds the first group that they have the free choice to say no, and says nothing to the other group, in both groups, the same, very high percentage will agree to continue their participation in the experiment. What this means is that conferring the formal freedom of choice does not make any difference. Those given the freedom will do the same thing as those implicitly denied it. This, however, does not mean that the reminder/bestowal of the freedom of choice does not make any difference. Those given the freedom to choose will not only tend to choose the same as those denied it, they will tend to rationalize their free decision to continue to participate in the experiment. Unable to endure the so-called cognitive dissonance, their awareness that they freely acted against their interests, propensities, tastes, or norms, they will tend to change their opinion about the act they were asked to accomplish. Let us say that an individual is first asked to participate in an experiment that concerns changing eating habits in order to fight against famine. Then, after agreeing to do this, at the first encounter in the laboratory, he will be asked to swallow a living worm, with the explicit reminder that if he finds this act repulsive, he can, of course, say no, since he has the complete freedom to choose. In most cases, he will do it, and then rationalize it by way of saying to himself something like, "What I am asked to do is disgusting, but I am not a coward. I should display some courage and self-control, otherwise scientists will perceive me as a weak person who pulls out at the very first minor obstacle. Furthermore, a worm does have a lot of proteins, and it could effectively be used to feed the poor. Who am I to hinder such an important experiment because of my petty sensitivity? And finally, maybe my disgust of worms is just a prejudice. Maybe a worm is not so bad, and would tasting it not be a new and daring experience? What if it will enable me to discover an unexpected, slightly perverse dimension of myself that I was hitherto unaware of? Beauvoir enumerates 3 modes of what brings people to accomplish such an act, which runs against their perceived propensities and or interests. Authoritarian, the pure command, you should do it because I say so without questioning it, sustained by the reward if the subject does it and the punishment if he does not do it. Totalitarian, the reference to some higher cause or common good which is larger than the subject's perceived interest. You should do it because, even if it is unpleasant, it serves our nation, party, humanity. And liberal, the reference to the subject's inner nature itself. What is asked of you may appear repulsive, but look deep into yourself and you will discover that it's in your true nature to do it. You will find it attractive. You will become aware of new, unexpected dimensions of your personality. At this point, Beauvoir should be corrected. A direct authoritarianism is practically non-existent. Even the most oppressive regime publicly legitimizes its reign with the reference to some higher good, and the fact that ultimately you have to obey because I say so reverberates only as its obscene supplement discernible between the lines. It is rather the specificity of the standard authoritarianism to refer to some higher good. Whatever your inclinations are, you have to follow my order for the sake of the higher good, while totalitarianism, like liberalism, interpolates the subject on behalf of his own good. What may appear to you as an external pressure is really the expression of your objective interests, of what you really want without being aware of it. The difference between the two resides elsewhere. Totalitarianism imposes on the subject his or her own good, even if it is against his or her will. Recall King Charles's infamous statement, "If any shall be so foolishly unnatural as to oppose their king, their country, and their own good, we will make them happy by God's blessing, even against their wills." Charles I to the Earl of Essex, 6th of August, 1644. Here we encounter the later Jacobin theme of happiness as a political factor, as well as the Saint-Justian idea of forcing people to be happy. Liberalism tries to avoid, or rather cover up, this paradox by way of clinging to the end, to the fiction of the subject's immediate free self-perception. I don't claim to know better than you what you want. Just look deep into yourself and decide freely what you want. The reason for this fault in Beauvoir's line of argumentation is that he fails to recognize how the abyssal tautological authority, "it is so because I say so," of the master, does not work only because of the sanctions, punishment/reward, it implicitly or explicitly evokes. That is to say, what effectively makes a subject freely choose what is imposed on him against his interests and or propensities. Here, the empirical inquiry into pathological, in the Kantian sense of the term, motivations is not sufficient. The enunciation of an injunction that imposes on its addressee a symbolic engagement/commitment evinces an inherent force of its own, so that what seduces us into obeying it is the very feature that may appear to be an obstacle, the absence of the why. Lacan can be of some help here. The Lacanian master signifier designates precisely this hypnotic force of the symbolic injunction, which relies only on its own act of enunciation. It is here that we encounter symbolic efficiency, at its purest. The three ways of legitimizing the exercise of authority, authoritarian, totalitarian, liberal, are nothing but three ways of covering up, of blinding us to the seductive power of the abyss of this empty call. In a way, liberalism is here even the worst of the three, since it naturalizes the reasons for obedience into the subject's internal psychological structure. So the paradox is that liberal subjects are, in a way, those least free. They change the very opinion/perception of themselves, accepting what was imposed on them as originating in their nature. They are even no longer aware of their subordination. Let us take the situation in the Eastern European countries around 1990, when really existing socialism was falling apart. All of a sudden, people were thrown into a situation of the freedom of political choice. However, were they really at any point asked the fundamental question of what kind of new order they actually wanted? Is it not that they found themselves in the exact situation of the subject victim of a Beauvoir experiment? They were first told that they were entering the promised land of political freedom. Then, soon afterward, they were informed that this freedom involved wild privatization, the dismantling of the system of social security, etc., etc. They still have the freedom to choose, so if they want, they can step out. But no, our heroic Eastern Europeans didn't want to disappoint their Western mentors. They stoically persisted in the choice they never made, convincing themselves that they should behave as mature subjects who are aware that freedom has its price. This is why the notion of the psychological subject endowed with natural propensities, who has to realize its true self and its potentials, and who is, consequently, ultimately responsible for his failure or success, is the key ingredient of liberal freedom. And here one should risk reintroducing the Leninist opposition of formal and actual freedom. In an act of actual freedom, one dares precisely to break the seductive power of symbolic efficiency. Therein resides the moment of truth of Lenin's acerbic retort to his Menshevik critics. The truly free choice is a choice in which I do not merely choose between two or more options within a pre-given set of coordinates, but I choose to change the set of coordinates itself. The catch of the transition from really existing socialism to capitalism was that people never had the chance to choose the adquem of this transition. All of a sudden, they were, almost literally, thrown into a new situation in which they were presented with a new set of given choices. Pure liberalism, nationalist conservatism. What this means is that the actual freedom, as the act of consciously changing this set, occurs only when, in the situation of a forced choice, one acts as if the choice is not forced and chooses the impossible. This is what Lenin's obsessive tirades against formal freedom are about. Therein resides their rational kernel, which is worth saving today. Damn, my dog started snoring. Which is worth saving today. When he emphasizes that there is no pure democracy, that we should always ask who does a freedom under consideration serve, which is its role in the class struggle, his point is precisely to maintain the possibility of the true radical choice. This is what the distinction between formal and actual freedom ultimately amounts to. Formal freedom is the freedom of choice within the coordinates of the existing power relations, while actual freedom designates the site of an intervention which undermines these very coordinates. In short, Lenin's point is not to limit freedom of choice, but to maintain the fundamental choice. When Lenin asks about the role of a freedom within the class struggle, what he is asking is precisely, does this freedom contribute to or constrain the fundamental revolutionary choice? The most popular TV show of the fall of 2000 in France, with the viewer rating 2 times higher than that of the notorious Big Brother reality soaps, was C'est mon choix, it is my choice, on France 3, the talk show whose guest is an ordinary, or exceptionally a well-known, person who made a peculiar choice which determined his or her entire lifestyle. One of them decided never to wear underwear. Another tries to find a more appropriate sexual partner for his father and mother. Extravagance is allowed, solicited even, but with the explicit exclusion of the choices which may disturb the public. For example, a person whose choice is to be and act as a racist is a priori excluded. Can one imagine a better predicament of what the freedom of choice effectively amounts to in our liberal societies? We can go on making our small choices, reinventing ourselves thoroughly, on condition that these choices do not seriously disturb the social and ideological balance. For Slavoj, the truly radical thing would have been to focus precisely on the disturbing choices, to invite as guests people like dedicated racists, i.e. people whose choice, whose difference does make a difference. This also is the reason why today democracy is more and more a false issue, a notion so discredited by its predominant use that perhaps one should take the risk of abandoning it to the enemy. Where, how, by whom are the key decisions concerning global social issues made? Are they made in the public space, through the engaged participation of the majority? If the answer is yes, it is of secondary importance if the state has a one-party system, etc. If the answer is no, it is of secondary importance if we have parliamentary democracy and freedom of individual choice. Did something homologous to the invention of the liberal psychological individual not take place in the Soviet Union in the late 1920s and early 1930s? The Russian avant-garde art of the early 1920s, futurism, constructivism, not only zealously endorsed industrialization, it even endeavored to reinvent a new industrial man, no longer the old man of sentimental passions and roots in traditions, but the new man who gladly accepts his role as a bolt or screw in the gigantic coordinated industrial machine. As such, it was subversive in its very ultra-orthodoxy, i.e. in its over-identification with the core of the official ideology, the image of man that we get in Eisenstein, Meyerhold, constructivist paintings, etc., emphasizes the beauty of his/her mechanical movements, his/her thorough de-psychologization. What was perceived in the West as the ultimate nightmare of liberal individualism, as the ideological counterpoint to Taylorization, to Fordist ribbon work, was in Russia hailed as the utopian prospect of liberation. Recall how Meyerhold violently asserted the behaviorist approach to acting, no longer emphatic familiarization with the person the actor is playing, but ruthless bodily training aimed at cold bodily discipline, at the ability of the actor to perform a series of mechanized movements. Perhaps K-pop is Meyerholdian. This is what was unbearable to and in the official Stalinist ideology, so that the Stalinist socialist realism effectively was an attempt to reassert a socialism with a human face. I have never seen Žižek use so many words in caps. An earlier text, perhaps? I.e. to reinscribe the process of industrialization within the constraints of the traditional psychological individual. In the socialist realist texts, paintings, and films, individuals are no longer rendered as parts of the global machine, but as warm, passionate persons. The obvious reproach that imposes itself here is, of course, is the basic characteristic of today's postmodern subject not the exact opposite of the free subject who experienced himself as ultimately responsible for his fate, namely the subject who grounds the authority of his speech on his status of a victim of circumstances beyond his control? Every contact with another human being is experienced as a potential threat. If the other smokes, if he casts a covetous glance at me, he already hurts me. This logic of victimization is today universalized, reaching well beyond the standard cases of sexual or racist harassment. Recall the growing financial industry of paying damage claims from the tobacco industry deal in the USA, and the financial claims of the Holocaust victims and forced laborers in Nazi Germany, and the idea that the USA should pay the African Americans hundreds of billions of dollars for all they were deprived of due to their past slavery. This notion of the subject as an irresponsible victim involves the extreme narcissistic perspective from which every encounter with the other appears as a potential threat to the subject's precarious imaginary balance. As such, it is not the opposite, but rather the inherent supplement of the liberal free subject. In today's predominant form of individuality, the self-centered assertion of the psychological subject paradoxically overlaps with the perception of oneself as a victim of circumstances. Badiou himself gets caught here in the proto-Kantian trap of spurious infinity, afraid of the potential totalitarian, terrorist consequences of asserting actual freedom as the direct inscription of the event into the order of being. Was Stalinism not precisely such a direct ontologization of the event, its reduction to a new positive order of being? He emphasizes the gap that separates them forever. For Badiou, fidelity to the event involves the work of discerning its traces, the work which is, by definition, never done. In spite of all claims to the contrary, he thus relies on a kind of the Kantian regulative idea, on the final end, the full conversion of the event into being, which one can only approach in an endless process. Although Badiou emphatically advocates the return to philosophy, he thereby nonetheless displays the failure to grasp the fundamental, authentically philosophical insight shared by Hegel and Nietzsche, his great opponent. Does Nietzsche's eternal return of the same not point in the same direction as the very last of Hegel's encyclopedia? The eternal idea, in full fruition of its essence, eternally sets itself to work, engendering and enjoying itself as absolute spirit. For an authentic philosopher, everything has always already happened. What is difficult to grasp is how this notion not only does not prevent engaged activity, but effectively sustains it. The famous Jesuit axiom concerning human activity displays a clear presentiment of this insight. Here, then, is the first rule of acting. Assume/believe that the success of your undertakings depends entirely on you, and in no way on God. But nonetheless, set to work as if God alone will do everything, and do yourself nothing. This axiom reverts the common maxim to which it is usually reduced: help yourself and God will help you, i.e., believe that God guides your hand, but act as if everything depends on you. The difference is crucial here. You must experience yourself as fully responsible. The trust in God must be in your acts, not in your beliefs. While the common maxim involves the standard fetishist split of, I know very well that everything depends on me, but nonetheless, I believe in God's helping hand, the Jesuit version is not a simple symmetrical reversal of this split. It rather thoroughly undermines the logic of the fetishist disavowal. The political aspect of this gap is, of course, Badiou's marginalist anti-statism. Authentic politics should shun active involvement with state power. It should restrain itself to an agency of pure declarations which formulate the unconditional demands of égale-liberté. Badiou's politics thus comes dangerously close to an apolitical politics, the very opposite of, say, Lenin's ruthless readiness to seize power and impose a new political order. At the most radical level, the deadlock Badiou is dealing with here concerns the thorough ambiguity of what he calls l'innommable, the unnameable. Sorry, Beckett. What cannot be named is simultaneously the event prior to its nomination and the senseless factuality, givenness of the pure multitude of being. From the Hegelian standpoint, they are ultimately the same, since it is the act of nomination itself which retroactively elevates some feature of being into the event. This brings us back to Judaism and Christianity. Jews wait for the arrival of their Messiah. Their attitude is one of suspended attention directed towards the future. While, for a Christian believer, the Messiah is already here. The event has already taken place. How then does Judaism mediate between paganism and Christianity? In a way, it is already in Judaism that we find the unplugging from the immersion into the cosmic order, into the chain of being, i.e., the direct access to universality, as opposed to the global order, which is the basic feature of Christianity. This is the ultimate meaning of Exodus, the withdrawal from the hierarchized Egyptian order under the impact of the direct divine call.